All right, ladies and gentlemen, in this one, we're going to take a look at the mesh primitives geometry nodes. So here, if we go ahead, by the way, I have the reference sheet here in the UV editor and the 3D viewport over there. Let me minimize this here as we don't need it right now. If we go ahead and hit Shift A, you can see that right here we have mesh primitives. And this allows for us to add any kind of mesh geometry. This is very similar to going over here and hitting Shift A and adding a mesh right here. As you can see, we could add the same mesh primitives here. But what this allows for us to do is, let's say, for example, we don't want a cube here. Well, what we could do, again, we're going to want a UV sphere because we're creating a snowman. Of course, we could take the cube and subdivide it, but for this, we're just going to hit Shift A, go to Mesh Primitives, and we're going to get a UV sphere right here, and let's just put it right there. Now with this UV sphere node, we can now connect this to the group output, and it will create a UV sphere instead of this cube. So here we're going to take this new UV sphere and plug it into the geometry right there. And now we've changed our geometry from this cube right here to now a UV sphere. And if we quickly go back to the spreadsheet, you can see that we have a different position system right here for all of the vertices in our sphere. So as you can see, all of these different indexes have the different X, Y, and Z position for each of these points or vertices. Now, if we hit tab to go into edit mode right here, you can see that our original mesh is still this cube right here, because that's what our original mesh was, and we're just using a UV sphere geometry node to change it to a UV sphere. However, once again, you can see that the underlying mesh is still the cube. But this is pretty cool. You can see that right here, just like a UV sphere that we would add here, we have the segments and rings. So for example, if we bring this down, you can see we have less and less segments and less rings, as you can see right there. Also, you will notice that here we have a lot less indexes here on our column because obviously we have less vertices now. So now we have 22 vertices with 5 segments and 5 rings. Let me go ahead and hit Control Z to undo that and leave it to 32 and 16. Let's go back to the UV editor with the cheat sheet. And you can see that here with this UV sphere, we have obviously the output right here, which is green. Again, green is geometry, so it's outputting the geometry of the UV sphere. And right here we have 3 different inputs. Now these 2 right here are integers. And once again, if we go to integers right here, you can see that this green socket color right here are integers. And an integer is a number without a fraction or decimal. For example, 1, 3, 55, or in this case, 32 and 16. So here we could input different integers if we wanted to, but right now we're not going to input anything into these. So you could either set the integer right here or the whole numbers right here, or you could plug in something that will change or drive these numbers. And then right here we have a radius, which is set as a float. And you can see that a float accepts or produces floats. Now a float is a number that has a decimal place. For example, 1.4, 2.6, or 3.453. Now a float can be an integer or a whole number, but it also has the ability to have a decimal point or a fraction. So here you can see that if I shift, left click, and drag, you can see that here we could get, like for example, 1.24, which is a float, because again, a float is a number that has a decimal place or a fraction. So it's not whole numbers. Whereas these right here are integers, and we can't have, for example, 16.5. We could just have whole numbers with no decimal or fraction. All right, let me hit Control Z to undo that. So there we go. We have the segments, rings, and radius with the different inputs and the output right there. So now we've created this UV sphere, or not really created, but we've changed the structure of our geometry node and of our original cube object to be a UV sphere, which is really, really sweet. All right, very cool. And if we go back to hitting Shift A, go to Mesh Primitives, you can see we could add anything else. We could add, for example, a cone right here and put that right there. Now we could just connect this cone right here to the group output to preview it or see what it looks like. However, we could just go ahead and Control-Shift left-click a node and it will connect it to a viewer node automatically, which allows for you to preview things very fast by Control-Shift left-clicking them. Now this should work by default, but if it doesn't, go to Edit, Preferences, and under Add-ons, make sure to enable Node Wrangler by searching for Node and enable Node Wrangler, but it should work by default. So now we could Control-Shift left-click to see that or the cone. We could hit Shift-A, go to Mesh Primitives. Unfortunately, they don't have Suzanne or the monkey. No! We need to create a petition to get Suzanne here as a mesh primitive. No, I'm just kidding. All right, here you could add whatever else you see here. For example, we could add a cylinder, as you can see right there. So let's go ahead and delete these other ones. And I'm just going to have the UV sphere right there. So there we go. We have the UV sphere. That is the mesh primitives in geometry nodes. It allows for you to add different kinds of meshes here. And once again, they have different inputs and outputs depending on what they are. And of course, different points for each of these vertices in our 3D space. So make sure to save. In the next one, we're going to take a look at the transform geometry node. See you in the next one. Ciao for now. Au revoir.